Hey, Lifegroup leaders, I hope you're doing well today. I'm excited to get back into the book of Numbers. So, we just kicked this off. So, this is our second lesson. So, I'm excited about what God had taught us last week and what He's already speaking to us about this week. This week, we pick up in chapter 11. And so, I want to share with you some things from the book, share with you some things that aren't in your Lifeway book, and then maybe some practical things to think about for your group moving forward, what we can learn and how we can apply these specific verses to our life and make it really practical for your group members. So last week we were in the book of Numbers chapter 9. And so we were in chapter 9 with the details about the cloud that covered the tabernacle, how God guided it, how He was there for His people. There was a physical, visible presence there with His people, and He led them and He guided them. And so they were camped out at Sinai, and then it was time to leave Sinai. And so that's where we pick up in chapter 11. They camped. God was visible there. He guided them. What did it say in chapter 9? When God moved, they moved. When God stopped, they camped. They were obedient. And so we see in chapter 10 how they set out from there. Everything was going according to plan. Everything was happening like it should happen. But then in chapter 11, we see a marked change in the attitude of God's people and the actions of God's people. The people started to complain. And so we see in chapter 11, your book picks up in verse 4, where it talks about the riffraff or the rabble. Depending on your translation, it may use a different word there. It's actually the only place in the Bible where we see that word. But this is actually the second rebellion that we see starting in verse 4. There was another rebellion that started in verse 1. So I want to read that to you really quick. Numbers 11, verse 1, it says, "And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, His anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them." So things have been going well, and now the people started to complain. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But they were obeying, they set out, and then the people started to complain. And God was so angry that fire consumed the outer parts of the camp. Now, the outer parts of the camp would be where there was more imperfection and impurity. And so as violent as that seemed, it was actually also a display of God's mercy and God's long-suffering and restraint, that only the outer parts of the camp were consumed. And so that was the first rebellion that we see. And now our book picks up in verse 4, and then it goes on from verse 4 through 17. So your book talks about in verses 4 through 9 there were dissatisfied followers. We read in verse 5 the people who were in the riffraff, in the rabble. It says, "The riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. The Israelites wept again and said, 'Who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt, along with cucumbers, melon, leeks, onions, and garlic.'" It says, ironically, it would be humorous if it wasn't so sad. We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt. Do they really remember their life in Egypt? I mean, look at all the things that God had done for them, the mercy that He demonstrated to them, the way He guided them with a physical presence so that they could have a visual to know that He was with them and guiding them. And then now they have the audacity and the lack of memory to look back and say, "We remember all the good stuff that was back in Egypt. Do you remember how good we had it back then?" And so this is a pattern that we see, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But they said, we remember, but the first thing that popped in my mind when I read that is, I don't think you really remember what life was like for you there. It's funny how we do that. We can romanticize things from the past when we're unhappy with the present and think, oh, we had it so much better back then. I think a lot of times if we really went back to that time, we would remember, oh, I forgot about that. Because we like to remember the good things, we often forget about the bad things. And so the people are complaining. They even complain about manna. That they said, but now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at but this manna. This manna that was sweet as honey, that was provided by God, that was this wonderful food that He had given them. They were complaining about it. They were complaining about food that just was provided to them as much as they needed. They were complaining about the manna. So they were weeping, and then it says in verse 10, the Lord was very angry, and then Moses was angry, and then Moses asked the Lord, why have you given me all these people? Why are you angry with me, God? Why do you burden me with these people? Did I conceive these people? Should I have to be taking care of all these people? I can't generate meat. So the people wanted meat. Moses said, I can't give them meat. This is too much for me. I can't handle all this anymore. If this is how it's going to be, okay, this is Adam's paraphrase. If this is how it's going to be, and this is how these people are, just kill me. I'd rather die than have to deal with this all the time. I can't take it anymore. He's just throwing his hands up and wanting to walk away. And then God, in His mercy, says, Moses, bring me 70 men from Israel, known to you as elders and officers of the people. Take them to the tent of meeting, have them stand there with you. Then I will come down and speak with you there. I will take some of the Spirit who is on you. So as we've talked about before, as we've been going through Romans, even a sermon I just did several weeks ago, this is an example of how the Holy Spirit worked in the Old Testament. The Holy Spirit would rest on people for certain tasks. So He said, I will take some of the Spirit who is on you and put the Spirit on them. They will help you bear the burden of the people so that you do not have to bear it by yourself. And so God was very gracious in how He worked with them. And so a few things that I think we can learn. But actually, before we get to that, I want to share with you a bit from the New American Commentary. It's a great commentary. As I was reading about Numbers 11, it talks about the structure, the chiastic structure, which we don't really fully understand. We don't get it as much in our English translations. But the structure that you would read in the Hebrew would show a specific a contrast. They would have an understanding that we like in the English. But in chapter 10, it talks about, starting in verse 32, that Yahweh has promised good things, and then so it happened that the ark set out. So there's kind of this arising that happens in the passage, in this narrative. It says, rise up, O Lord, return, O Lord, as chapter 10 closes. And then so it happened that the people complained, and then Yahweh heard their complaining, and He was angry. And so this is what the writer of the commentary says about chapter 11. It says, the murmuring and complaining by the people of the hardships of the wilderness had been a continuous character trait since the initial stage of their departure from Egypt. They complained when the Egyptians approached just before the sea parted before their eyes. Exodus 14. They grumbled at Marah because of the bitterness of the waters. Exodus 15. Additional parallels have been noted by Milgram in that the grumbling at Marah occurred after a 3-day march from Egypt, followed by the quail incidents in Exodus 16. The Taberah grumbling occurred after a 3-day march from Sinai, then followed by the quail provision and judgment. So that's where we're at, chapter 11, 4 through 34. The people complained soon after they had seen God's miraculous work in the crossing of the Red Sea, and again soon after leaving the place where they had encountered Him in a special covenant relationship with Him. In the book of Numbers, this action constitutes a shift in the structural and theological movement of the book from one of unity, faithfulness, holiness, and celebration to one of discord, rebellion, and dissatisfaction with who they were as the people of the covenant. The text translates literally, and so the people became like those murmuring evil in the ears of Yahweh. God had promised good things, He had promised goodness and blessing, and yet the people responded with rebellious complaints. And so I wanted to read that to you because it reminds us of the pattern when they were traveling, when they were marching, when life wasn't as comfortable. I can't imagine what it was like having to walk with such a large group of people through desert, through wilderness. It had to be uncomfortable. They would complain, and even though they'd seen God part the Red Sea, they'd seen God do all these amazing things, they still complained. When the least little thing got hard, when things weren't comfortable, they started complaining. It's really a sad demonstration of our human nature. And so we see Israel doing that. So I want to share some things that you can take away from some of these verses now. I think it's important, and I think our people will just inherently understand what they can learn from reading through this passage. But there are some other things I think I want to make sure that you take away, that they take away too. Obviously, like I talked about in verse 5, we remember. Did they remember? We become familiar with God's blessings, and we take it for granted. When life is going good, when the bills are paid, when there's food on the table, when the car is not tearing up, when nobody's sick, when the roof on the house is good, when everything's going fine in life, you got a little change in your pocket, we become familiar with God's blessings. And then we start taking them for granted. And then when the least little thing goes wrong, what do? We complain. We say, God, where are you? Why have you allowed this to happen? I can't believe that you do this to me. We become familiar with God's blessings and we take them for granted. The least little thing happens, goes off track in our minds, and we start blaming God. We're no different than the people of Israel. And then in verse 10, so this started with a riffraff, a collection, a rabble as it was described. And then in verse 10 it says, Moses heard the people, family after family, weeping at the entrance of their tents. So this started with a collection of people, a smaller group of people, and then it spread across all of Israel where everybody was complaining. It reminded me of a saying I was taught a long time ago: misery loves company. Paul said it this way, 1 Corinthians 15:33, be careful who you associate with. Be careful who you hang out with. Paul says, bad company corrupts good character. I think what we can learn from verse 10 and the spread of this complaining is that we should be careful who we listen to. We should be careful who we give attention to. Are the people that we're listening to, are these people that we see growing in their walk with God? Are these people that we see chasing hard after God to become more holy, to become better husbands and wives, better mothers and fathers? Or are these people who are always complaining? You know people like that. You've probably worked with them. You've had a neighbor, whatever. There's always somebody that's complaining about stuff all the time. Doesn't matter what's going on. Be careful who you associate with. Be careful who you listen to. In verses 11 through 15, I think we can see from the attitude of Moses and how Moses just laid it all out before God. And what really struck me with that, it was a reminder to me in the way Moses communicated with God, is that God can handle your stuff. Like, God can handle your sadness. God can handle your grief, your anger, your frustrations, whatever you have going on in life. God can handle that. God's big enough and strong enough, has big enough shoulders to carry that. When you're going through a hard time, go to God with it. You're not going to interrupt God's day. You're not going to bother God. take it to him and cry out to him with whatever that you have going on. And then what we see after that is in verses 16 through 17, God's patience. Now, God's patience will run out, and we see that in the Bible at times where Moses didn't always do things exactly right. We see our heroes of the Bible not doing things exactly right all the time, and God's anger is poured out at times, and his patience does run out at times. Here we see a great example of God's mercy and patience. He could have told Moses right here, you are whining and complaining, and I'm not going to listen to you. But what did he do? He said, Moses, bring me 70 men that you see that are as elders and officers of the people, and we're going to set this up so that you don't have to bear the burden of this all the time. And then, past what the book covers this week, we see where God did provide meat. God provided so much meat that it was unbelievable. But then we see again that it says, even as the people were chewing the meat, as the meat was between their teeth, people complained. It's still not good enough for them. And so then we see a plague that happened, which was pretty much what most people think was demonstrated through food poisoning, basically. And so we see that even as God was patient with Moses and provided him help, and then he provided the people meat after they'd been complaining that what they had wasn't good enough, we see that pattern continue, that this pattern of complaint and not being satisfied with what God gives just continued on and on and on. And so it's easy for us to look at Israel and think, man, these people, when are they ever going to get it? But I think one of the big takeaways for us is that we do the same exact thing. You know, when life gets hard, when it's not how we want it to go, what do? We blame God, which instead, maybe what we could be asking is, here's a sign of a really mature Christian. And I wish I could say that I always do this, but I definitely don't. When something goes wrong in my life, I perceive it as going wrong. Instead of asking, what is God trying to teach me right now? How can I grow more to be like Jesus through this? I blame God too. I say, God, why did you allow this to happen? So I think it's our natural sinful human nature that causes us to react in that way. But the people that we want to listen to, the people that we want to be around more and more, are the people who are slower to speak, slower to get angry, and they ask themselves, what's God teaching me through this right now? What has God blessed me with right now? And so one last thing to think about, how can we not forget what God has done? Because we said they don't really remember, and they're not remembering what God has done. So for us, how do we do something to help us remember? What do we do to not forget? A few things that you can do, and here's just some tips for your group. Write things down. When God answers a prayer, when God blesses you in some way, whether this is in a journal or whatever you want to do, write it down and talk about it. Talk to your spouse about it. Talk to your kids about it. Talk about it later. Create a tradition. Now, we don't want to do things that cause us to worship symbols or do anything like that, but create a tradition where you have this time that's built in where you can give thanks and remember the blessings. Thanksgiving, the holiday Thanksgiving in November. This will be a great time to give thanks and reflect back on what God has done in that year. That's what we see God telling the people of Israel do through the Old Testament. The feasts and the festivals that they performed they were visual, hands-on, practical reminders to the people of what God had done for them and what they were called to do. We see in the book of Joshua, in Joshua 4, the 12 memorial stones. He told them to go and get 12 stones, one representing each part of Israel, stack up these stones, and the children are going to come to you one day and they're going to say, hey, what are these stones about? Then you're going to tell them about what God did. about how God allowed his people to pass through, about how God parted the water, about how God provided for his people. So they created a visual that would make the children ask questions, and it would be something to remind them, hey, we need to remember, here's how God blessed us, here's how God moved. So what could that look like for your family? That might be something you could ask your life group members about. What's something that you do, or what's something that you could do with your family to remember the blessings of God? Lest we be like the people of Israel and forget and forget and forget. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. Remember, if when I'm teaching this passage this week, I'm going to start in verse 1 of chapter 11 with the first rebellion, and then connect the dots between 9 and 11, where we see that they were at Sinai. So now they're moving, they're not camped anymore, and that's when things start to go bad. So then there's the first rebellion, verses 1 through 3, and then the book picks up in verse 4 with that second rebellion. So again, I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions about anything, let me know. Appreciate all you guys do, praying for your life group, reaching out to your life group. I know summer's been over for a little bit now, but you may have some people who still haven't made their way back yet. Shoot a text out to them, mail them a card, give them a phone call. Sometimes people are just waiting for that invite for them to come back. So reach out to those people they haven't seen in a while. But so thank you for doing that. Thank you for preparing to teach, and thank you for praying for your people. This church would not be what she is without you and your hard work and dedication. So appreciate you. I hope your lesson and your preparation goes great. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, and have a good day.